want to try to make sure I get to all 12 at least. So we had Peter, and now we have Andrew, who is Peter's brother. He was he preached the gospel around Greece. He also went a little east of there. He's known around that Ukraine, that Russia area, kind of on that border of Europe and Asia. But he died. Well, he was crucified in Edessa, Greece, and two ends of the cross were fixed on the ground. So basically, it wasn't you picture a cross, you think of a really long pole this way and a short one this way. But his was kind of like this, and he was where the middle of my arms are. That's where his middle was. He was crucified like this, and these two ends were in the ground, and his arms were on these ends, and his legs were on my elbows ends like that. And that's where you get, if you look up St. Andrew's cross, you'll see what I'm talking about. But anyways, that's how he was died. That was God's plan for his life. I'm not being condescending here. I'm just being realistic. These things happened. And James, this is James the Greater, also known as one of the sons of Zebedee, which I referred to earlier when he says, remember how I talked about drinking the cup? Where was that at? Matthew 20? Yeah, he says, you will indeed drink my cup. Jesus tells them, when they request to be seated at his right and left hand in the kingdom. They say we are able to drink the cup, and indeed they did drink the cup, because in Acts chapter 12, if you remember, not really much is known about James the Greater, but it was known that during the time Agrippa, this is not, when it says Herod, and obviously Herod's dead by this time, this is Herod Agrippa. This is a different king. James, the brother of John, was killed by the sword, which means beheading. That's how he was killed. Now John, which when I say John, I'm referring to the fourth. This is the fourth disciple I've mentioned. I've mentioned Peter. I've mentioned Andrew. I've mentioned John, James's brother. I mentioned James, John's brother, and now I'm going to mention John. John is the author of John's Gospel, of course. He was also the author of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation, which he received while he was in prison at Patmos, which was where he lived the bulk of his life, where he wrote most of these things that happened. John was the only disciple, the only out of the 12, not even excluding Judas. You can include Judas if you want, because he committed suicide, so he didn't die of natural causes. But even including Matthias, who was some say that he wasn't really the new apostle, because when it refers to him in Acts chapter 1, verse 20 and 26, about how there was supposed to be one to replace Judas, he was the one that they chose when the lots were cast. But notice that's the one they chose. Jesus, I believe that Paul was the 12th apostle that replaced Judas, because he's the one that Jesus chose. And look at all these epistles and his legacy. But anyways, John, he was thrown into a cauldron. He was thrown into a boiling cauldron. This was before he was in prison at Patmos, and he survived. He actually didn't even suffer an injury. So you just think about the grace of God over his life, because this was before he wrote Revelation. God's like, this message had to get out. Revelation is so enlightening. If you read through there and really study the cross references in Matthew 24 and Zechariah and Ezekiel, a lot of the Old Testament prophets, and even some of the books, and you'll find how important it is that message got out, and how important it is going to be in the coming time of tribulation. But that was just God's grace over his life, that he lived through that. And he was the only disciple who wasn't martyred. He was released at Patmos, and he died about 100 AD, just of old age. There's your happy story. Okay, and I want to talk. And the fifth, Bartholomew. also known as Nathaniel in other when he's mentioned in other Gospels, he's not always called Bartholomew. He's called Nathaniel sometimes. This is one of my favorite ones. He preached in Armenia, which is present-day Turkey-ish area, Middle East. Well, a lot of them preached in the Middle East, in Turkey and Greece. Also, he did go to India as well, because he translated Matthew's Gospel to Indian. So he had some involvement there. He was reportedly skinned alive, and he didn't die after being skinned alive, and beheaded. He was going to be crucified, but on his way up, he was reported to be preaching to passerbys. This is while he's skinned alive. He's preaching to people, so they had to behead him to get him to shut up. That was just amazing. I can't even imagine. You want to talk about enduring to the end. This guy's skinned alive, and he's getting crucified by idolaters, and he's preaching to them. And they take off his head because he won't shut up. He won't stop telling the gospel. Number 6, Thomas, known as Doubting Thomas. He preached in Iraq, Iran, and later on he preached in India. And because a lot of East Coast, wherever that is, there's a Mount St. Thomas. I'm not sure where that is, but that's near his death location. He was speared to death by four different people. Speared him to death. That was his death. And there's a mountain dedicated in his name, Mount St. Thomas. Is it 6 or 7? Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, well, regardless, Philip. Not the Philip in Acts 8 or whatever. That's the deacon Philip that they appointed. If you look on early on in Acts chapter 6, they appoint several deacons, including Stephen, who I'll mention later. But this Philip was a disciple. He preached in west central Turkey, later on in Carthage, which is in northern Africa, and he was martyred. Actually, Carthage is, well, it's in that Mediterranean area, because he was martyred in Hierapolis, Greece, and here's his story before he was martyred. This is how he was, and basically he led a Roman proconsul's wife to the Lord. And this infuriated him, and so he was sentenced to death. He was sent to prison, and that's where he was martyred. It was in Greece. And he wasn't just crucified. He was also, it was reported that he was treated with great cruelty. So they beat him, and I guess you can kind of relate it to how Jesus was beaten before he was crucified. I'm not sure the severity of the beating, but it was great cruelty. So however you want to interpret that. Then we have Matthew, who wrote Matthew's Gospel, of course, and he's also called Levi, which is a Jewish name. He was martyred in Persia, and he was killed by a halberd. So that's a very long pole with you have a pole, and you have this kind of like a watermelon shaped blade, I guess is the best way to describe it. But it's really sharp. It kind of comes in like this off the pole. So it has this, it's kind of like an axe, but it's a really long, and it only has one side blade, or it may have two. But the point here is that that's a terrible way to die. That was God's plan. I'm not being Calvinistic when I say that's God's plan. It's like, he wants people to die. This is in ways that they're glorifying God. They have a legacy. All these disciples, the areas they went to, they built churches. They converted many people to the Lord. They stayed true to the gospel. The reason they were martyred and killed is because people didn't want to hear it. If you tell the true gospel, you're not going to be liked. And that's why so many churches are friends with the world, because they're not telling the true gospel. Jude, not to be confused with Judas. He's also called Thaddeus. He preached in Iraq, Iran, kind of like Thomas. But he also, later on, he was crucified at Edessa, Greece. So you see that kind of repeating, that Greece crucifixion. It was very popular in Romans during the first century. Matthias, who I talked about earlier, replaced Judas in Acts chapter 1. Doesn't ever talk about him again in the Bible, aside from Acts chapter 1. But he was reportedly stoned at Jerusalem and beheaded. So he was stoned at Jerusalem, and that didn't kill him, kind of like Paul was stoned, and that didn't kill him. And he was later beheaded. And James the Lesser, as he's known, to not confuse him with John's brother, the son of Zebedee, he first preached in Israel, Palestine, present-day area, and he was martyred in Egypt. He was stoned, not only stoned, but his head was clubbed to death, and this was at he was 94 years old when he was clubbed to death by Jews in Egypt. God, I cannot even imagine. Lord have mercy. 94 years old, preaching the gospel, gets clubbed to death. He clubbed his head in. There are reports about his the insides of his head being different places, but that's just terrible to even realize. And the last disciple, this is number 12. Well, I guess I've mentioned at least 14 of them, but like I said, John the Baptist of course wasn't a disciple. I think Paul replaced Judas, and I'm not mentioning him here in this list because he didn't glorify God in his death. So the ones I've mentioned are John the Baptist and Matthias are the only two who weren't apostles. Matthias and Paul. I think Paul did a little more because it was actually written in the Bible, but that's just me. Anyway, Simon the Zealot, he preached in Africa, northern Africa, around Ethiopia, kind of where a lot of other people preached, such as Carthage and areas like that. He later preached in Britain. He went all the way to Britain, and that's where he was crucified for his gospel. There are other reports saying that he was hacked to death, because this is a completely separate one. See, the problem is when you look up these things, you get separate reports, so you don't really know what to believe. All you know is that they died, they were martyred. So I'm going to give you both of them. The first one is that he was crucified in Britain. Second one is that he preached in Persia, which is completely the opposite way of Britain, and he died because he was hacked to death, whatever you want to take that to mean, because he refused to sacrifice to Persia's sun god. And Stephen, the deacon that they appointed, his entire story is told in Acts chapter 6 and 7. If you want to read that for yourself, that doesn't need any outside history from Josephus the historian, or most of these come from. I looked up Fox's Book of Martyrs. You can look it up on the web. Just type in Fox's. That's Foxe. Fox's Book of Martyrs. It's a free. It is a book, but there's a PDF file online, which is a public. It's completely free. You can look up all this for yourself. But anyway, Stephen, he was in a court situation. I'm just going to sum up Acts 7, where he was preaching to the Jewish council. Basically, his crime was blaspheming God because he claimed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and he was stoned to death. And when it says in Acts, he was. And they stoned Stephen as he was calling on God and saying, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not charge them with this sin." And when he said this, he fell asleep. So, kind of similar when Jesus was on the cross and he said, "They know, Father, do not hold this against them, for they know not what they do."